Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude, and our topic for tonight is labor, war, and empire. And we have three guests who will be discussing this on camera, live. And it's John Witeck from Board of Water Supply, right?
Hawaii People's Fund.
And you are president of Hawaii People's Fund.
I am.
And you are also a labor and community activist. So welcome to the show. Thank you very much. Yeah. And then Liana Petranek, she has a PhD in political science, and you also were active in the Association for Flight Attendants at Hawaiian Airlines, Honolulu base.
Yes.
Yeah, a while back.
Ex officio of the union.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And Steve Dinion from the Musicians Union, and you are also co-convener of Hawaii Labor for Justice and Peace.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes,
thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So to open up this timely topic, labor and the effects of the war and the notion of empire and the practice of empire in terms of the United States on labor issues. For instance, you have been active in also U.S. labor against the war, U.S. law. Right. So could you tell us something about your activities and about the organizations you are with?
Sure. Hawaii Labor for Peace and Justice is a kind of an ad hoc committee formed in early 2003. A number of labor folks in the community who were trying to look for ways that as workers and as representatives of workers, how we should react to what was going on in terms of the build-up to war with Iraq, in terms of what was happening with the Bush administration's war on terror, so-called. Kind of got together and started to talk about ways to understand what effect do these wars have on workers. And some folks from hotel workers, Local 5, and a number of different unions got together, and we had four main areas that we were looking at. One, the most important or most timely, was to oppose the efforts the Bush administration was building towards going to war against Iraq. We were also looking at what we saw as a war on immigrant workers that seemed to be growing. Also the war on civil rights through the Patriot Act. And finally, the war on government workers that the Bush administration was spearheading, particularly people in the Defense Department, Department of Homeland Security. So those are our four main areas we were looking at, and mostly trying to find ways to educate and organize workers in Hawaii around those four issues.
Yeah, that's great. But Liana, I thought that George W. Bush always talks about war for freedom and democracy and peace worldwide and so on. So what's with that kind of notion? And what is Steve talking about? It doesn't jive with what W. Bush is talking about. So what do you think?
Well, I think he's speaking Orwellian language, or the language of the neocons, because war for peace and democracy is not actually what is happening. What we're doing is we're alienating the world through this war in Iraq, and actually what we're doing is creating havoc in the Middle East. And this is mainly being done to protect the interests of U.S. corporations and also the interests of U.S. and the oil reserves in Iraq. Of course, everybody knows that Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. And one of the major reasons why we're there, why we are there, is to protect our oil interests in that region.
Yeah, so John, I mean, you have been a long-time labor and community activist, and you were like with Hawaii Government Employees Association at some point. And so when you hear all this talk about war and, its impact on the economy and so on, how do you think it affects workers from your perspective, especially here in the United States? And perhaps later on we can talk about globally, because I know that you have interest in the Philippines workers movement and so on.
It was interesting, the last negotiating committee I was on with HGEA, the government came in, or Lingle, I think, even gave a speech saying because of the war situation, the effect on tourism, et cetera, Hawaii's revenues will go down. So the government, the offer was just 0%, for a long time. And the only way a pay raise was a modest one, was through arbitration. But we could see there the direct impact of the war on Hawaii's economy and the U.S. economy. In general, war takes away resources that could be used more productively. It puts them into instruments of destruction. It takes away young people to go fight in these wars. It creates tremendous havoc to families. I think Wahiawa has been decimated some, and so the businesses are being hurt. So there's been, just locally, and with the leaving of the 29th Brigade going, this will be more impact, both economically and on human beings. And for unions, I think this has taken a toll as well. I know in the city workforce, we've lost people in the National Guard who have been subject to this secret backdoor draft, sent over there for a year or two or made to do other duty. And that takes an impact on job situations. Often we're short-staffed in our various agencies and departments. It has a very harmful impact on workers in the U.S. And all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to remind our viewers that this is live all over the state except for Maui County. 956-5670 on Oahu, 1-800-342-7949, neighbor islands. So we'd like to hear from you, comments, questions, what have you. So we can have a lively discussion here. Let's hear about your concerns in those regards. What I want to do now is go to a segment that from an interview I did with Robert Perkins, who's professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaii, and he talks about democracy and the United States and the notion of empire. So when the roll-in is ready, we can play it.
U.S. leaders tend to define democracy in very particular ways. And to a certain extent, the American people seem to go along with that. But they try to conflate civic democracy, the idea that you can choose your elected officials and control your own destiny and speak your mind and organize with your peers to make changes in your communities and so on, with economic free enterprise and the freedom of corporations to conduct themselves as they see fit for profit. And Bush always makes very clear when he's itemizing the freedoms he thinks is most important, those are always linked together. In Iraq, it's quite clear that the freedoms they were really, that the sort of democracy they wanted was really all about free enterprise and not very much about civic democracy. They have been shutting down newspapers, throwing out television stations. There isn't the sort of autocracy in Iraq that there was under Saddam Hussein, of course, but there hardly has been and there has been a flourishing of free expression in Iraq, but not because the Provisional Authority has really been encouraging that flourishing.
Because of the chaos, maybe.
Because of the chaos. And when formations have emerged that are really radically criticizing the U.S., like Muqtada al-Sadr's movement, and they were publishing a newspaper, the coalition, the Provisional Authority ended up shutting that down. Where they, in the beginning part of the occupation under Paul Bremer's rule, where they really put their emphasis was not on rebuilding universities and encouraging free television stations and so on. Instead, they built their own TV station that put out American propaganda, and they really focused on the economy. They, one of his first acts in office was to throw out of work 500,000 state workers, most of them in the military, but in all sorts of other state enterprises as well. They cut the corporate tax rate in Iraq from 40% down to 15%, a flat tax across the board that Forbes and others have been dreaming of imposing in the United States. They threw open all of the borders of Iraq to free trade and had no tariffs for imports and exports. They began a process of privatizing state-owned Iraqi companies on favorable terms to the buyers, although they've had to back off from that as it's degenerated into chaos, and as the United Nations has made clear that that's a pretty profound violation of international law and the UN resolution that granted the British and the US occupational authority in Iraq. And most dramatically of all, they have implemented the programs that the U.S. and the IMF and the World Bank have been urging many countries to implement, but mostly without success, to cut down limitations on transnational corporations pretty much down to zero. In Iraq, it's set up that foreign companies can come in, repatriate 100% of their profits to their own countries without paying any taxes in Iraq.
Well, here, like Liana, we're talking about privatization and all these kinds of things that are, free market kind of movement to privatize Iraq's industry, etc. And so far, this has failed, considerably failed. But this doesn't jibe with the notion of democracy that Bush talks about. So. Another aspect of the thing is that in terms of Iraq, if we were to develop democracy and so on, as Bush is thinking about it, you see that the grassroots movements in Iraq who are democratic, just like trade unions and so on, and we shall talk about that, further on those topics later on. But what he's talking about, Bush, and the practices of the United States are markedly different in this regard. So could you say something more about that?
Well, I think one of the major reasons, and this is tied to the oil aspect of the invasion, is that Saddam Hussein was pegging his oil to the euro, and this was a great concern to the United States, not only because he sits on the second largest oil reserves in the world, but you see, if he's going to be pegging his oil to the euro, what's going to happen is it's going to cause financial dislocations in the United States because almost all of the oil is pegged to the dollar. And what's happening is that you have a fiat dollar, and it's by oil decree and not based on the gold standard, because actually after the Second World War, we had $30 billion in oil reserves. Not oil reserves, gold reserves, and the dollar was pegged to the gold. But then after the Vietnam War, we were $500 billion in debt, and we didn't have $30 million dollars in oil reserves, gold reserves. So we only had left about 10 million in gold reserves. So what they had to do was float the dollar. And because of that, we have a trade imbalance. And this is causing a lot of problems within the world and for the United States. Now, if all of the other countries follow suit with the direction that Iraq was going, that would cause a major problem for the United States economy. So we are looking after our interests in that area and trying to stop the trend toward the euro, and also make sure that our capitalist system would also have influence in that area with the multinationals, because actually if you look at imperialism, the thing is the role of the United States government has always been to protect the interests of the multinational corporations. In the early 60s, Kennedy categorically denied that we were after Pax Americana, but that has dramatically changed in the era of George Bush. So what you see now is the Bush administration protecting the interests of the multinational corporations that are actually tied with the United States economy.
Yeah. So they are after privatization and so on.
Right.
But is there, John, like a larger agenda, not just in terms of Iraq, but say in terms of the Middle East? Because we hear talk about not only democratizing Iraq, but in fact democratizing the entire Middle East. Wow. That, to me, that's a tall order, but could you say something about that?
Well, I think it pretty much came out in the planning of the war, even before 9/11. I think immediately after they started the neocons, or the neocon conservatives, whoever they are, those crazy people around Bush. Developed a plan for pretty much expanding into the region. Iraq, the war there, the invasion was the centerpiece. From that, then they would move out. They would have bases. They would have more control. Oil is there, but it's sort of they're on a mission to make free enterprise everywhere, and by free enterprise, it's not really that free. It's a huge conglomerates like Halliburton and you know, all their subsidiaries. The Philippines too, wherever the U.S. says they're for freedom and labor rights and all that. In Iraq, they've actually curtailed them. The labor code now, I think, is the Saddam Hussein code and worse. So for workers in Iraq, it's been a nightmare. Unions have been suppressed. But I think there's a plan, a strategic plan for the region, which is interesting. Oil, we know, is a finite commodity. What about alternative fuel economies, et cetera? Why is it so strategic? Who are their longer-term opponents, like China eventually? You know, how does it all fit into that? But I think Iraq was meant to be the beginning domino for us that would make it all come into our hands. But I think it's probably been proven or shown to be a fiasco, and the piece is starting to crumble.
Yeah, Steve, like from your perspective in terms of U.S. labor against the war, and also your Organization for Peace and Justice, Hawaii Labor for Peace and Justice, do you have any further comments on this in terms of the impact of all these kinds of actions, Bush's actions, on labor, you know, potential or, yeah?
Sure. I think in a number of ways. One is that I think what we're seeing in Iraq is an example of what Bush and his folks want to do everywhere, want to do in the U.S. It's like a training ground or a sampler of what they'd like to happen. As John mentioned, the suppression of unions, absolute selling off of the entire public sector, of all the, you know, of everything there. That's kind of free trade gone, free enterprise gone nuts, is obviously clearly what he would like to do in the U.S. And he took another connection is under the cover of this war on terror and war on Iraq is the direct war on workers in the U.S. One of the first things that happened within a short time after 9/11, before we even went to war against Iraq, was what happened to the ILWU on the West Coast in the U.S. The ILWU was locked in a pretty bitter fight with a very intransigent management, the folks on the West Coast who run the docks, the waterfront. And what happened was the management side there immediately got their friends in the White House, through all their corporate connections, to get involved in what was just strictly a union management fight. And under the cover of saying that this was about national security, Tom Ridge, the Secretary of Homeland Security, threatened to invoke the Taft-Hartley laws and Taft-Hartley Act, and to actually get involved in this and say that this dock workers, any kind of labor dispute was actually hurting national security, and therefore had to stop.
Yeah. So you think, like, you know, in this case, if any department, federal department would intervene, would be the Department of Labor.
Exactly.
But,
right.
Yeah, but this is like the new times we're in. What I want to do now, we have a segment from David Bacon, who came over here about 2 weeks ago or so, and he's an independent reporter and also associate editor of Pacific News Service, and he's author of Children of NAFTA, which is a pretty good book. I hear. I haven't read it yet. He gave a talk at the ILWU Hall, and this is part of his talk showing photos about Iraq and Iraqi workers.
Here, workers told us that they felt that the U.S. occupation had an economic purpose to it. And the reason for that is that they saw the name of their factory in a list published in a newspaper in Iraq, a list that was issued by the Occupation Authority of enterprises that were due for privatization. In fact, Bremer hired ex-fundraiser of Bush, a guy named Tom Foley, who was put in charge of the Private Sector Development Agency. And when we were in Baghdad, Mr. Foley was publishing lists of factories like the Mamoun vegetable oil plant as lists of ones that were on the chopping block. At the same time, there have been conferences organized periodically in London and Washington by so-called management consultants who essentially put the assets of the Iraqi government out on the table, meaning the factories, the railroad system, the healthcare system, and then invite corporations in, Delta Airlines, for instance, and other ones, to come in and bid on possible assets that they might be interested in buying in a privatized Iraq. Now, for workers, this is a very threatening possibility. The manager of the oil refinery, a guy named Dathar al-Khashab, told us, if I put on the hat of privatization, I'm going to have to fire 1,500 of the refinery's 3,000 workers. In America, he said, when a company lays people off, there's unemployment insurance and they won't die from hunger. But if I dismiss employees now, I'm killing them and their families.
Yeah, well, this is what we have been talking about in terms of impact of the invasion on Iraqi workers who are not resisting, with machine guns, etc. They're just like trying to organize grassroots labor unions and take care of their daily needs and so on. And the United States, as we mentioned before, is not in for this kind of democracy. It is their particular democracy that they want, And so here you see that even the people who are not opting for resistance, etc., just like for organizing grassroots labor organizations, would be alienated by the United States through these kinds of issues of privatization and so on. So it's something that David Bacon, when he went with a delegation, labor delegation from the United States to Iraq from U.S. law, U.S. labor against the war, these were some of the concerns that workers were talking about. And he's of the opinion that workers here and workers there are really fighting the same fight. And this is something that you mentioned, But in what other ways do you think we can fight for democracy and freedom here in alliance with the Iraqi workers and with workers beyond Iraq and even beyond the Middle East? So John, could you speak to that?
There probably are groups that are doing solidarity with Iraqi workers. There's just little information about their struggle and what's been happening to them. And of course, the mass media is a corporate media, so they're not really interested in spreading the news about suppression of workers' strikes and organization. For other countries, there have been solidarity committees between labor and unions. There are some very good ones with Mexican workers. I'm with the Philippine Workers Support Committee. What we try to do is bring unionists from there to this country and send delegates to their struggles and conferences in the Philippines and actually visit conditions in the country, see what is going on. And generally, around the world, the U.S. has led an assault on workers' wages and benefits, has supported the World Bank and the IMF and cutting government support and holding the line on wages, wage freezes, etc. So this is our government that's promoting this in favor of these huge corporations. At the same time, they're saying, take American jobs and we will give corporations benefits, tax breaks, to send those jobs to another country like the Philippines or China. This impoverishes American workers who lose their jobs. There's been a huge loss of jobs. There's been a real deterioration of their wage standards. And in the receiving country, the kinds of conditions in those factories are incredible. They're like 1910, 1920. Poor ventilation, 10-hour days, 6-day work weeks. And of course, we're told they should be happy that they're getting these great jobs, like in the maquiladora in Mexico, where workers' health and safety and the environment are all being eroded. This is the American empire today. Mess over the American workers, impoverish them, take away their rights. And I think in this election campaign, I think there are some issues head-on like that. For labor, the re-election of George W. Bush will be a major threat to its very existence. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to rally the forces and make sure that doesn't happen. Around the world, I think American labor has to be, and labor in Hawaii, be much more proactive, much more out there, and link the Iraq war to solidarity with Iraqi workers and workers in the Middle East and all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Liana, in terms of like what Kerry is talking about, like, well, if I'm elected, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, you know, in regards to try to roll back what Bush is doing in Iraq. But in terms of relations with labor, is it the imperative of empire that drives these forces in the manner that is driven regardless of president? Or is it that Kerry has a different plan? He keeps telling us about his different plan. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think what people have to realize is that we live in a capitalist system, and the capitalist system has internal systemic contradictions, which means that it has to compete in the market. And in order to compete, it has to drive down its costs. So one of the targets in the capitalist enterprise, in fact, the major target in the capitalist enterprise is going to be labor, because the other costs are fixed costs, and there's nothing they can do about it. Labor is a variable cost in the capitalist production matrix. So that's the target that they're going to hit. So if we look at what has been happening to labor and in the past few years or in the past few decades, what you see is an erosion of the workers' pay and working conditions. What's happening is there's been a consistent attack on unions. At one point in time, we were unionized to about 25% of the whole labor workforce. Now it's like down to 11%. And now with the Patriot Act, they are even targeting government workers. We have a friend that works on the ship in Pearl Harbor, and now they disallowed the union there because it's a threat to security, so-called threat to security. Yeah, under the Patriot Act. So I mean, people have to realize, they have to become educated that there are a lot of problems with the direction that our country is going. And the thing is, labor has to think about what the priorities are, because the thing is, if we don't organize and if we don't resist these attacks on labor, what's going to happen is we're going to lose more and more. And you can see what's happening in our country. A lot of the jobs are being outsourced, and a lot of people who had lucrative jobs making $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year, we just saw them on TV. He's been cut back, unemployed. Now he's working for $10 an hour, and they're going to outsource his job too, so he doesn't know what he's going to do. I mean, this is really horrifying for a lot of people, because you have no means to support yourself. You have families. I mean, what are we going to do? We gave $172 billion in tax cuts to corporations on May 11th. Congress passed that. $172 billion would go a long way in lifting the minimum wage, providing support for workers, creating jobs in the public sector and the private sector. Why are we farming out all this money to corporations? That is an outrage. Yeah. People have to know what's going on and demand that the government takes a more positive stand on workers' rights and our pay, working conditions, and our wages.
Yeah, but also we should not mislead the people by saying that outsourcing is the major problem. It's a significant problem, of course, but doesn't cannot speak for all the jobs that are being lost and the lower quality of jobs that are being created. But it is significant. Like they say, out of say 2 million jobs, maybe 800,000 or so, go for outsourcing. But that's a significant number. Yeah. But still, the problem is much bigger. As you say, the dynamics of capitalist production and capitalist enterprise are the ones that drive this kind of contradiction forward, right?
Yeah, also I forgot to mention the development of technology, which has allowed for the development of the forces of production to robotization and all kinds of other developments in electronics that have put a lot of people out of work. And then another thing that's a real problem in the U.S. economy is the contingent workforce that now makes up about 30% of the workforce. And what happens in that situation is those people do not have benefits like people who work full-time or who are organized under unions, and therefore they're living on a subsistence wage. So it's and a lot of them have to have 2 and 3 jobs in order to make it.
Right.
Yeah.
So why don't we go and watch another segment from Michael Eisenschar, who's also national organizer of United States Labor Against War, U.S. law. And he was also here about 2-3 weeks ago, and he talked with David Bacon at the ILW Hall. And then we can go to Steve and see your comments on those things. So we roll.
In U.S. Labor Against the War, we don't just talk about the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. There's another war, and that's the war being prosecuted with equal zeal against us, against working people in this country. It's a war against the American working class. Grover Norquist got his start in California as a tax reform crusader. He supported Prop 13. He is now the most powerful lobbyist in Washington. He said his goal is to shrink government down to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. The Wall Street Journal, not some left-wing rag, the Wall Street Journal calls him the V.I. Lenin of the anti-tax movement. He's the general leading the charge. He wants to abolish the IRS, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Education, and the National Endowment for the Arts. In an interview with Bill Moyers in 2003, he said, and I'm quoting, "We've set as a conservative movement a goal of reducing the size and cost of government in half in 25 years, which is taking it from 1/3 of the economy to about 17%. Taking 20 million government employees and looking to privatize and get other opportunities so that you don't have all those jobs presently done by government employees. We need a federal government that does what the government needs to do and stops doing what the government ought not to be doing." And in his view, what the government needs to do is what I said earlier: courts, prisons, cops, property rights, privatize the rest.
So Steve, like these are some of the things we were talking about before, but this is also the view of U.S. Labor Against the War. But you know, Michael talks about some people who want to cut government to zilch or -0, in fact. So, in fact, there are a lot of nuts around who want to do that beyond the neocons and the White House and the Pentagon. So, could you say something more about that from your perspective?
Sure. Certainly one of the more frightening things, and not just since George W. Bush came into office, but obviously this proceeds through Clinton and Reagan before him, has been this desire, this movement to destroy the public sector, to destroy the kind of the social compact that was created in the U.S., built up through things like Great Society and the New Deal, and even back to the progressive movement. I mean, there are folks who seem like they want, like Grover Norquist, who seem to want to take us back to the 1890s or the robber barons or whatever, things like that. These are things, a lot of these. There are a lot of protections that have been built in over the years in the U.S. to help to soften the impact of capitalism for workers, things like Social Security and Medicare. And all of those things, public services, public education, all these things are clearly under attack. And I think we can see both the costs of this never-ending war on terror, hundreds and hundreds of billions, however much it's going to end up being, is money that could have been spent in other places, that could have shored up Social Security easily, that could have provided all kinds of protections for unemployed workers and retraining and all kinds of things, instead going into a war. All the way down to the hidden costs, things like John mentioned, that You've got these National Guard, these reservists, who are often just a lot of police officers and firemen and all kinds of folks at the local level who have now been sent off to fight, and they'll be gone for a year or God knows how long. And the cost that that's having on local governments as well is tremendous. And at the same time that's happening, the federal government's been cutting assistance and has also been putting additional costs on local governments. You have now all these new security requirements that are out there. So it's they really are. This war serves that purpose really well, to drain, to stop the flow of money, the flow of any kind of support, to help average working people get by.
So, like, you know, firefighters in Iraq, instead Americans who go there and who are here as firefighters would be engaged in firefights there rather than fighting fires. So it's kind of interesting there. But you know, when Liana, when a neocon hears Steve talking this kind of talk, he says, you are engaging in a class warfare. And my goodness, this is a no-no for the neoconservatives, because we are all Americans and all that kind of stuff, and brothers and sisters and so on. And this whole notion of just the term working class is also like anathema to people. Although once, I remember a long time ago, Reagan, in a speech, he was talking about the working class. I say, whoa, what is this? Is that the President of the United States?
Confused with the movie he was in.
But he was acting still, you know, I mean, from the pulpit, bully pulpit. But anyway, could you say something about this kind of propaganda? Is that if you say that there are haves and have-nots and poor and rich and so on, you are engaging in class warfare?
Well, just the other night I was watching Jay Leno, and Kevin Eubanks' lead singer was singing about revolution. So it's becoming mainstream now. People are getting pissed off about things, and they're talking about revolution, and they rightly so, they should be, because if we look at the situation that we're in and how much money we're spending in Iraq, I mean, this is really alarming. After the Vietnam War, we were $500 billion in debt. And like I said, we only had $10 billion in gold reserves left. We had $30 billion before. Look at what's happening now. In 2000, we had a surplus of $236 billion. And in 2004, that fiscal year, when this fiscal year ended, we were in debt for $422 billion, which would have been a lot more because they raided the Social Security Trust Fund by $153 billion. Otherwise, it would be like 600-something billion. And look what happened after the Vietnam War. We went into major economic recession and stagflation, and people really suffered. I mean, people are going to be suffering for this folly that not only folly, but these diabolical designs of empire that the Bush administration has in the Middle East. So, I mean, people need to be concerned about that.
Isn't it like there's no limit on how much debt they can roll up? I mean,
Yeah,
it's just
there
amazing
isn't,
how...
because the dollar is a fiat.
We fight for a $200 million school lunch program, but there's $70 billion for Iraq for this. And also this whole thing of privatization. Is it that corporations are such great models? I mean, we've had Enron, we've had all this corporate corruption, but why do they want to turn every school district into a CEO type thing? Why is that why are they promoting this model? And I think the reason is it's more profits, it's higher paid people within these big corporations. Yeah. But they're decimating the public sector. Our infrastructure is falling apart, bridges, roadways. When you travel through the U.S. now, you're appalled. And many of our cities look like parts of Baghdad after what we've done to Baghdad.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
So,
I just want to say one other thing. They just approved the $447 billion defense budget. And that amounts to over $1 billion a day. Now, what do you think is going to happen to all of our workers? I mean, instead of pumping that money into the economy in that kind of infrastructure work and all that, what's going to happen? There's no jobs, and soldiers, poor people in different towns are going to sign up in the military because there's nothing else available to them. They're going to be putting their lives on the line and getting a pittance of a pay as a soldier. You know,
Yeah.
when they could have put that money into the economy, building up
Good
infrastructure
job.
for schools and bridges and roads, and also put some money into healthcare, have a nationalized healthcare like every other industrialized country in Europe and Canada has.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an outrage that we don't have a national healthcare system where
Right.
people would be able to go to the hospital, not have to worry about not being able to pay for it.
And here we're not talking about like changing the entire capitalist system. We're talking about ameliorating some of the problems that
Right.
it has. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we still have some time, but I want to go to another segment from David Bacon, and he talks about labor unions and strikes. So we roll when we're ready.
This is the headquarters, or was the headquarters of the Iraqi Federation of Trade Unions and the Transport Workers Union. Soldiers arrived there, and they arrested the leadership of the Federation, 8 members of its executive board. They threw the union out of its offices. They tore down all of those banners and signs that you see there and threw the Federation out. The people were only held in jail for overnight for 24 hours, but the message was pretty clear, and that is if you continue doing what you're doing here, we're going to come down on you really hard. The head of the Iraqi Union of the Unemployed, which is part of the other federation, has been arrested 3 times for leading workers in marches and demonstrations down to the gates into the so-called green zone, which is where the occupation authority and now the U.S. Embassy sits, and demanding revolutionary things like jobs and unemployment benefits. There have been 3 general strikes since the occupation started, mostly in Basra and the south of Basra. At the Southern Oil Company, which is one of the 2 big oil companies in Iraq, there's one for the oil wells up north near Kirkuk and Mosul, and then there's another one for the oil wells near Basra. At the South Oil Company, workers threatened to stop oil production if the ministry didn't rescind that $40 base wage order. And the oil minister flew down to Basra and sat down and first of all agreed that he would reinstitute the previous $60 base rate. And then the union did its own price survey to determine what they felt was fair as a base industrial wage, and they concluded that it should be about $87 a month. And in January of this year, the oil minister finally agreed to implement the wage that the union had suggested.
Yeah, so I mean, the situation has deteriorated since January of this year. But anyway, what I just wanted to show this, to show that it's not isolated incident. I mean, there have been general strikes and so on, and people really fighting for true democracy, etc. And the American forces who are there for democracy and freedom are fighting against those workers. Anyway, what I want to do now is go to another segment by Robert Perkinson. And he talks about the labor movement here, and then we can have discussion. Some of the things that we have mentioned so far, but already. But let's go for that, and then we have more discussion.
And to the credit of the labor movement, this has all happened much faster than it happened during the Cold War and during the Vietnam War, in which labor traditionally from the 50s until the 80s or so was really quite conservative on foreign policy and quite integrated to the kind of knee-jerk anti-communist policies pursued by the U.S. abroad. And that's really changed in this. I mean, the eruption of anti-war sentiment in the build-up to this war is really unlike anything in world history. It was the largest anti-war demonstrations in American history, without question the largest coordinated international protests against any war or against anything in global history, with absolutely millions of people turning out to the streets in the lead up to this war. And to labor's credit, the leaders of the AFL-CIO and a variety of unions in the U.S. and in Hawaii as well very quickly recognized that what the Bush administration did not, that there was a great potential for disaster in Iraq, and that even if it went well, U.S. security interests were very poorly defined in the conflict. And from the kind of narrow, self-interested perspective of labor, they knew it was going to cost a whole lot of money. And now, under current appropriations, it's already cost some $200 billion, which in a society that's growing increasingly unequal, now we have a unequal distribution of income in the U.S. comparable to what it was in the 1920s before the Depression. And so before the New Deal and before the Great Society, all of that incredible kind of humanization of capitalism that the U.S. and European powers undertook after the Great Depression in creating kind of social democracy and trying to harness the productive capacities of capitalism, but to try and mitigate the social inequities unleashed by it. All of that isn't totally undone, but it's being undone. And certainly labor could have thought of a lot of ways to spend $200 billion.
Yeah, so these are some of the stuff you were talking about, in fact. But you mentioned also the Taft-Hartley Act as an attack against labor, and this was like from 1947, right? So could you say something about the Taft-Hartley Act and how it can be used to attack labor right now in terms of this homeland security milieu that we are living in?
Sure, I'll do my best. I'm not a labor historian, but from what I understand, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947 over the veto of President Truman, and its main purpose was to put back, to push labor back. That the feeling amongst in business was that labor had too much power. That the Wagner Act, which was passed in 1936, thank you, had given too much.
35, actually.
Okay, had given too much power to workers, and there have been, I guess, number of strikes after World War II, and workers had made a lot of steps forward. And so one of the things in the Taft-Hartley Act, besides making it much more difficult to organize, making it much more difficult for workers to join unions, set these 30-day waiting periods for a worker has to join. But one part of this that I understand was used against the ILWU is that gives the president the power to force workers back to work in the case of a strike, or to make I think it's an 80-day waiting period. And so what Bush did in 2002 with the West Coast dock workers was to say, even though that was not a strike, actually that was a lockout. Management had locked out the workers. It was not even a strike. So this is the first time it had ever been used in this way to actually force the workers back to work when they had not gone out. And that put a lot of pressure on the workers, and the threats kept growing about what else. I think it actually gives the president the power. Right, the president could have actually forced them back to work and said that if they didn't, there would have been various fines.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because in terms of homeland security, etc. One could imagine, for instance, a situation where workers would want to go out on strike to protest the war. And then they would be hit by the, Taft-Hartley Act. So that's an interesting thing. And in fact, that would, put a major impediment against labor in terms of trying to build that grassroots movement against empire and against the war in Iraq and the Middle East, because this is coming up. War in the Middle East generally is coming up. So this is a next chapter in the drive for empire.
Another thing about the Taft-Hartley Act was that it outlawed secondary boycotts, and that makes it very difficult for workers to carry out a general strike and really paralyze the economy. So that was a setback to labor when that act was passed.
Yeah, we have a comment, I think, from Michael from the Big Island. He says, we may not understand that the culture of America is destroying the planet. Those that we call terrorists are actually working for life. So thanks, Michael, for your opinion. And we can maybe comment, well, some of our comments basically are in that general understanding of what's going on in terms of, the drive for empire. Actually, it kills a lot of people, as we know, in one way or another. But what I want to do is also go to another segment, which is Michael Eisensher's segment. He's talking about U.S. labor against the war and how it was formed, etc., to corroborate some of what you have said, and then we can have more discussion. So we roll.
U.S. Labor Against the War was formed in January of 2003 in a meeting that was called as an emergency conference in Chicago at the hall of the second largest Teamsters union in the country, the largest UPS union, Local 705. More than 200 delegates participated from unions across the country representing about 2 million workers. They came together to try to prevent a war. We didn't succeed. We didn't prevent the war. But we did build an extraordinary and unprecedented anti-war movement within the American labor movement. It's part now of a global movement of opposition to King George and his policy of militarism and unilateralism and preemptive war. And by the way, the whole concept of preemptive war is a kind of misnomer. There was nothing to preempt, as we now know. There was no threat. The war in Iraq is pure and simple a war of aggression. It's a violation of international law. George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Wolfowitz, the whole gang should join Augusto Pinochet and Henry Kissinger as international war criminals. They should be prosecuted and put away. They are a danger to society. Now, in 2003, in October, U.S. Labor Against the War reconvened in a National Labor Assembly for Peace in the same hall in Chicago. And we established U.S. Labor Against the War as a permanent organization, not just to talk about Iraq or Afghanistan, but to look at the whole broad implication of how U.S. foreign policy impacts us as working people here. We now have something in excess of 85 affiliated organizations.
Yeah, so here he mentioned some of the stuff that you talked about, but expanded it to talk about what needs to be done here in terms of those people who are going for war and taking a lot of people with them, like our kids and brothers and sisters and so on. So what I want to do is go for summation by looking at one last segment. Robert Perkinson's talking about what the labor movement should do, because I think there are immediate tasks that are confronting us here. And then I'd like to hear from you also after talking, seeing what Perkinson has to say. We're all.
Labor movement would do better to focus on organizing new workers as a whole and to focus its resources there rather than on supporting Democratic candidates for office and diverting the tens of millions of dollars they're paying to register voters and run ads for the Kerry campaign. I think that money would be better spent trying to organize Walmart and try to increase the percentage of American workers that are in labor unions, which would then give organizations like U.S. Law and High Law a greater forum to begin trying to use those union shops not just to fight for better wages and benefits, but at the same time try to raise consciousness about a whole variety of issues about the way the country is run and the way that we have moved away from the dream of an American middle class and a social safety net that was assembled during the New Deal and during World War II and during the Great Society, and now has been under vicious attack by neoconservatives now for more than a generation.
Yeah. But here now, like I think the question is moot now if Labour should, support Democrats, because November 2nd is around the corner. And also we are confronted by the situation that the idea is to defeat Bush, not necessarily that one loves Kerry, that you want to vote for him, but you have to defeat Bush, and then we get more democratic space and more space to organize in the grassroots, etc. But any views on that? Like maybe Liana first?
Well, I think what we should do is pull out of Iraq and give the $82 billion that was appropriated by Congress to Iraq and the people that are living there so that they can rebuild their country. And I think we should direct that money that we're using for the defense budget into the economy. And workers should be more conscious of what's happening in the economy and start organizing more forcefully within the private sector and in the public sector.
Mm-hmm. And, Steve, this is plausible. I mean, we're not talking a pie in the sky, because the peace movement now has been in the millions in the United States and elsewhere. So, your opinion.
And it's one of the amazing things to kind of bring this together with what Michael and Robert were talking about from the labor movement side, is that not only U.S. labor against the war, but huge national unions like AFSCME and SEIU and the mail carriers and CWA have actually taken strong positions at their national conventions, in some cases brought from rank-and-file delegates on the floor, calling for immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq.
Yeah.
It is clearly something that more and more people in the U.S. are coming to understand.
Right. This is something that Kerry wouldn't want to do. He wants to go and finish the job. John?
Yeah, I agree with all these sentiments. I think the key thing is the labor movement must bring the movement back into it and mobilize people and educate. And locally, I think their unions are part of these national unions that have very good stands. But if you look locally, there hasn't yet been enough action electorally, or even, and particularly to organize new workers. I think that is crucial. And then to make alliances with other groups fighting for good things. Fight for living wages for workers, fight privatization more firmly, be more active. Don't just lobby at the legislature, mobilize. So I think there's a lot more we can do locally. But there's some promising signs nationally.
And work on things like, low-cost housing, because this is a workers' issue as well, and this way you connect to the communities as well, and so on. So, well, anyway, we still have like a minute or so. So any final thoughts on
I'll just
that?
throw one more thing in from U.S. Labor Against the War, and talking about the future. They have called another convention to happen in December, regardless of who wins. And I think that's a very positive sign, too. There's no question from U.S. law's viewpoint that whoever wins, the fight has to continue and has to grow in other areas.
That shows a mature movement developing and so on. So we have a lot to, ahead of us that we have to deal with. But the first step has been taken, and hopefully we can do what needs to be done for the sake of constitutional rights, freedom, democracy in this country, and so on. So I want to thank you for this discussion and for taking the time to do so. And thanks our viewers for watching, and see you next month. It will be an interesting topic as well. Mahalo nui loa. So,